I want to start with some of the highlights here. You were able to beat on your third quarter net margin in a quarter that we had so many industry plagued by supply chain issues, higher prices. How was Ericsson able to avoid some margin compression?
Thanks, Dani. It's great to be with you, and thanks for having me. Now, if we look at the third quarter, of course, we were hit by loss of sales in China, and that has been to the tune of about 3.6 billion or 6% of our sales. So that we have largely compensated with growth in other markets. So what we have been able to do, we've put in place a strategy some years back where we focused on investing in R&D, which actually has been the key contributor to our strengthening of gross margin. And it's actually the key contributor of keeping a good gross margin during this quarter as well, because we use R&D in order to actually take costs out and develop a more competitive portfolio. We see that in networks, we see it in digital services as well. So that's why we're holding up and actually improving gross margin compared to last year. I would also say we see some effect from retroactive IPR agreements, which actually helped a bit in the quarter as well. And finally, we see Cradlepoint, the acquisition we did last year for enterprise applications that actually drives gross margin as well.
So you talk about this investment that's helped you maintain some of that gross margin, but of course, still in the quarter, you were hit by more supply chain issues than you and many people had been expecting. Does that mean that your investments within your own supply chain, within your own capabilities, need to be ramped up even more than they had been previously?
I would say we actually managed to have little to no interruptions actually in our supply chain up until late in the quarter, where we experienced some shortages of some individual components. That had some impact on sales, and basically, if we wouldn't have had those disturbances, we would have had a normal seasonality actually for the quarter. What we see is that we see the same type of supply disturbances posing some threats to the fourth quarter, but I would still not exaggerate them and put them at the front and center. But I think it is fair to say that we see some disturbances. It comes in the semiconductor supply chain, but it also comes in other type of components. And we're working very hard to build extra inventory, buffer stocks, etc., to manage the supply situation during the fourth quarter and into next year. So we're quite comfortable about that, but it could be some threats.
You also mentioned issues surrounding China, some loss of business there. Borje, do you see any of those geopolitical tensions easing and allowing Ericsson to make more headway yet again in the region?
I think, we often like to think of the world as falling into two buckets, one that we can impact and one we can't impact. Geopolitics, I feel we cannot impact. It's managed by other agendas around the world. So we have been focusing really on how can we gain footprint in other markets. And you have seen us in the third quarter, for example, sign an agreement with Malaysia to build a 5G network. We have signed an agreement with AT&T that's one of the largest in our history. So you see us instead focusing on winning business where we can win business, and that's what we try to do across our portfolio. Then, of course, it's a bit of a headwind in China, that's for sure. But we are also committed to China. We're going to try to regain footprint there. That's an effort that's going to take some time, but if you're there, you can at least strengthening the position. So let's see what we can do.
Right. Amid all of this, one of your activist investors and top shareholders, indeed, Cevian Capital, has said that there's ample room for Ericsson to give a payout to shareholders. Is this something you're considering?
We typically have a discussion in the board about the distribution policy, which will be public and when we report the Q4 result. Then we can also discuss how capital surplus should be treated. But I would also say, and we have proven through the Cradlepoint acquisition, that we actually can make inorganic moves that strengthen the company and creates value for the company. And therefore the shareholders. So it becomes a trade-off of capital allocation in the future.
So quickly here, we have less than 45 seconds. Are you then considering more M&A to come after, as you say, this successful acquisition?
I think it's important for Ericsson strategically to strengthen our presence in the enterprise market. And to do that, we will most likely have to include inorganic growth as well. We're of course investing organically, and you see that in our dedicated networks, our IoT, as well as building out Cradlepoint. But I think we have opportunities to strengthen ourselves through M&A here as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate it. That's Ericsson CEO Borje Ekholm.